Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Hmm.
You know how much we love to unpack these books about business and tech, and today we're taking a close look at Bill Gates.
The one and only Bill Gates.
Yeah, the man who I think you could say pretty much shaped the personal computer revolution. And I think it's fair to say that he had a huge impact on how all of us work and live and play, in today's world.
Absolutely. His fingerprints are everywhere.
Right. And so we've got some fascinating excerpts from this book, Business the Bill Gates Way by Dearlove.
Yeah.
And we're going to try to distill, what were those strategies that made Bill Gates so successful? What was his secret sauce, so to
Yeah.
speak?
What made him tick?
Exactly right. So get ready for a deep dive into the mind of a man who was, well, he was part tech genius, part ruthless competitor. And it seems like he had this almost uncanny ability to anticipate what was coming next in the world of technology.
He was ahead of the curve for sure, and that's what we're going to try to understand today. How did he do it?
Exactly. So one of the first things that jumps out from the book is this idea of what Dearlove calls nerd power.
Nerd power. I like that.
Yeah, so, for a long time, business leadership was all about, the traditional corporate executive,
Hmm.
the suit and tie crowd.
The old guard.
Yeah, exactly. But then comes along Bill Gates, and suddenly the nerds are in charge, right? It's like a whole new breed of leader takes over.
It's a real shift in power, and I think Dearlove makes a compelling case that the old guard, the traditional business leaders, they just didn't get it. They didn't grasp the revolutionary potential of the personal computer.
They didn't see the vision.
No, they didn't. But Bill Gates, he was a computer nerd from the start. I mean, this guy started programming when he was just a kid. He lived and breathed technology.
Right, he had that deep understanding.
Absolutely. And that's the key. It's not just about seeing the potential. It's about having the technical knowledge to actually make it happen, to build the products, to write the code.
So can you give me an example? How did this nerdiness actually play out in Gates' business decisions?
We'll take the graphical user interface, for example, the GUI.
The GUI, right.
Yeah, back in the early days of personal computers, most computers relied on these clunky command line interfaces. You had to type in all these arcane commands to get anything done.
Not very user-friendly.
No, not at all. But Bill Gates, with his deep understanding of software, he saw the power of making computers more visual, more intuitive.
Easier for the average person to use.
Exactly. He bet big on the GUI, even though a lot of people at the time thought it was just a gimmick. They thought it was all about flashy graphics and not enough substance.
So he was willing to go against conventional wisdom.
He was. And that's a decision that a traditional, non-technical executive might have been too risk-averse to make. They might not have had the confidence to bet on something so radical.
But Gates had the vision and the technical chops to back it up.
Precisely. And that's why the GUI ultimately won out. It made computers accessible to a much wider audience.
Okay, so that's one example of nerd power in action. But let's talk about one of the most pivotal moments in Microsoft's history, the IBM deal.
Oh yeah, the deal that launched Microsoft into the stratosphere.
Exactly. The one where they secured the contract to provide the MS-DOS operating system for IBM's first personal computer.
A masterstroke of strategy, as Dearlove calls it.
But it sounds like there was a healthy dose of luck involved as well.
There always is right place, right time. But Gates also made his own luck to a certain extent.
So walk me through this. How did it all come together? What did Gates do that others wouldn't have?
Okay, so picture this IBM. They need an operating system for their new PC, and they're on a tight deadline. Gates, being the ambitious go-getter that he is, sees this as a massive opportunity.
But here's the thing, he didn't actually have a suitable operating system ready to go, did he?
Not quite. He had this other operating system that he'd been working on, but it wasn't a perfect fit for IBM's needs.
So what did he do? Bluff his way through it?
In a way, yes. He convinced IBM that he had exactly what they needed and that he could deliver it on time. Now that takes some serious salesmanship.
But he was also taking a huge gamble, right? What if he couldn't deliver?
Oh, absolutely. But Gates was a calculated risk taker, and here's the key. He recognized the power of creating an industry standard. He knew that if MS-DOS became the standard operating system for IBM PCs, it would have a ripple effect throughout the entire industry.
So everyone else would have to follow suit.
Exactly. It's like what happened with VHS versus Betamax in the video cassette world.
Yeah.
One format wins out, and it becomes the dominant force.
Gates was playing the long game.
He was. He was thinking several moves ahead.
Okay, so he secured this deal with IBM, even though he didn't have the product yet. What happened next?
Well, he had to scramble, of course. He found this small company that had developed an operating system called 86DOS, bought it for a song, really, and then adapted it to IBM's specifications.
That became MS-DOS.
Exactly. And the rest, as they say, is history.
So a little bit of luck, a lot of strategy. And a whole lot of hustle.
Absolutely. That's
Got
the
it.
Bill Gates way.
Now, we've talked about his nerd power and his strategic brilliance, but there's another aspect of Gates that Dearlove really emphasizes in the book, his almost uncanny ability to anticipate future trends. It's like he had a crystal ball or something.
He did have a knack for seeing where the tech world was headed.
So give me some examples. How did this play out in real life?
Well, one example that comes to mind is his early championing of CD-ROM technology. Remember back in the day, floppy disks were the standard for storing data,
Oh, yeah, I remember those days.
and they held a tiny amount of information compared to what we're used to today.
Like a few megabytes, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, something like that. But Bill Gates, he saw the limitations of floppy disks, and he understood that the future of computing would require vastly greater storage capacity.
So he saw the potential of CD-ROMs.
Exactly. CD-ROMs offered this huge leap forward in terms of storage, but there was a problem.
What was that?
It was a classic chicken and egg scenario. Nobody wanted to develop CD-ROM titles because there weren't enough CD-ROM drives out there. And nobody wanted to buy the drives because there wasn't enough software available.
So it was a stalemate.
It was. So Bill Gates, being Bill Gates, he decided to take matters into his own hands.
What did he do?
Microsoft, under his leadership, started creating its own early CD-ROM titles. Things like multimedia encyclopedias and educational software.
To give people a reason to buy the drive.
Exactly. He essentially jump-started the entire CD-ROM market.
So he was willing to invest in the future, even though it wasn't a guaranteed win?
He was. He had this incredible faith in the potential of CD-ROM technology, and it paid off big time. CD-ROMs eventually became the standard, and they paved the way for the even greater storage capacities we have today.
It's amazing how he seemed to just know which technologies were going to take off.
He had a vision, and he wasn't afraid to bet on it.
So we've got nerd power, strategic brilliance, and this almost prophetic vision for technology. But there's more to the Bill Gates story, right?
Oh yeah, we're just getting started. One thing that I always found interesting about Gates is how he built his team.
Yeah. How did he go about finding the right people?
Well, Dearlove uses this phrase, the talent magnet, to describe Gates's approach to recruiting, and I think it's a pretty apt description.
So what made Microsoft such a magnet for talent?
Gates recognized early on that the success of any tech company hinges on its people, and he was absolutely laser-focused on hiring the very best, the brightest minds in the industry.
Did he just look for people with the right technical skills?
That was definitely part of it. But he was looking for something more. He wanted people who were not just good programmers, but exceptional problem solvers. People who could think outside the box, push the boundaries of what was possible with technology.
So it was about a certain mindset, a certain intellectual firepower.
Precisely. They even had a term for it. They called them high IQ people.
IIQ people.
Yeah, and they built a whole culture around attracting and retaining these top performers.
What did that look like?
Well, they created this thing called the Microsoft campus, which was designed to be more than just a place to work. It was a whole environment, a kind of a mini city, almost dedicated to fostering creativity and collaboration.
That's pretty cool.
It was. They had this deliberately collegiate atmosphere with casual dress codes, open workspaces, and all sorts of on-site amenities like gyms and game
It
rooms.
sounds like they were trying to create a place where people would actually want to come to work every day.
That was the whole idea.
Yeah.
Make it a place where brilliant minds could thrive. And it worked. They had incredibly low turnover for a tech company, which is pretty remarkable considering how fast-paced the industry is.
People wanted to be part of the Microsoft phenomena.
They did. They wanted to be part of something special, a place where they could learn and grow alongside other brilliant minds.
It's like being on a winning sports team.
Right.
Everyone wants to be on the team that's going to the championship.
Exactly. And that brings us to another side of Bill Gates that we need to talk about, his competitive spirit.
Yeah, I've heard stories. He wasn't exactly known for being a pushover.
Let's just say that Gates was willing to do whatever it took to win. He was not afraid to use Microsoft's market dominance to his advantage. And sometimes that meant pushing ethical and legal boundaries.
Okay, give me an example.
Well, one example that comes to mind is when Microsoft went head-to-head with Borland, a company that made a popular software development tool.
What happened?
Microsoft released a product that was very similar to Borland's, essentially cloning their functionality, and they also made it very difficult for Borland to integrate their software with Windows, which was the dominant operating system at the time.
So they were using their control over Windows to stifle the competition?
In a way, yes.
Mhm.
And it eventually led to legal challenges and accusations of monopolistic practices.
So he was a tough competitor.
Oh, absolutely. He had this single-minded focus on winning. And that sometimes led him to make decisions that were controversial, to say the least.
But you can't argue with the results. He built an empire.
He did, and it's a complex legacy, no doubt about that. But it's important to understand both the brilliant and the ruthless sides of Bill Gates.
Absolutely. It's all part of the story. So we've talked about his nerd power, his strategic brilliance, his competitive drive. But there's another fascinating concept that Dearlove explores in the book, this idea of Microsoft as a learning machine.
A learning machine. That's an interesting way to put it.
So what exactly does he mean by that?
Dearlove argues that one of Microsoft's greatest strengths was its ability to learn from its mistakes and adapt quickly.
Most companies would probably try to sweep their mistakes under the rug.
Oh, for sure. But Geit had a different approach. He actually fostered a culture where failure wasn't seen as a taboo, but as an opportunity for growth.
So it was okay to make mistakes as long as you learned from them.
Exactly. There's this great anecdote in the book about Gates's annual memo called The 10 Great Mistakes of Microsoft.
He would actually list out his mistakes publicly.
He did. He wanted to create a culture of self-reflection and continuous improvement.
So it's not about avoiding failure, but about learning from it.
Precisely. And this learning machine mentality was evident in everything Microsoft did. They were constantly experimenting, iterating, adapting their products and processes based on feedback from the market and their own internal assessments.
So it was a very dynamic environment.
It was always evolving, always pushing the boundaries.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So we've got this culture of learning, but how did Gates actually structure Microsoft as it grew into this massive global corporation?
Well, that brings us to another interesting concept from the book, what Dearlove calls the bite-sized business approach.
Bite-sized business. Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Tell me more.
So we were talking about this bite-sized business approach. How did that actually work in practice?
Yeah, how do you break down a massive company like Microsoft into these smaller, more manageable units?
Well, Gerth believed that smaller teams were inherently more agile and more creative. They could move faster, experiment more freely, and take risks without being bogged down by bureaucracy.
So it was about maintaining that startup mentality even as the company grew.
Exactly. He called it divide and conquer.
Mhm.
And it seems counterintuitive, right? You'd think that as a company gets bigger, it would need to become more centralized, more top-down in its decision-making.
Right, more layers of management.
Exactly. But Gates went the opposite direction. He broke Microsoft down into these smaller, more autonomous units, each with its own specific focus.
So it's like he was creating a bunch of mini startups within the larger Microsoft umbrella.
That's a great way to put it. And it allowed Microsoft to stay nimble and responsive, even as it grew into this global behemoth.
Okay, so that makes sense. But there's one more piece of the puzzle that I want to touch on, Bill Gates' relentless drive. His almost obsessive focus on staying ahead of the game.
Ah, yes. The man never seemed to rest on his laurels.
It's kind of paradoxical, isn't it? This guy built a global empire, achieved incredible success, and yet he's still driven by this fear of being left behind.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Dearlove calls it a latent fear, this constant awareness that the tech world is in perpetual motion and that standing still is not an option.
So it's not just ambition. It's almost a sense of paranoia. Like he knew that success today doesn't guarantee success tomorrow.
Exactly. He understood that the tech landscape can shift so dramatically in such a short period of time. Companies that were once giants can quickly become dinosaurs if they fail to adapt.
Like IBM, for example.
Exactly. Or Xerox. They had a hand in developing some truly groundbreaking technologies, but they weren't able to capitalize on them in the long run.
So Gates was determined to avoid that fate. He didn't want to see Microsoft become another cautionary tale.
Absolutely. And that's what fueled his relentless pursuit of innovation. He was constantly asking, what's next? How can we get there first? He wasn't content with simply maintaining Microsoft's current position. He wanted to be leading the charge, shaping the future.
And that's reflected in their trajectory, right? They were early adopters of CD-ROM technology. They embraced the internet. We've made significant investments in cloud computing and AI. It's like they've always got their finger on the pulse of what's coming next.
They do. And it's not just about chasing every shiny new object that comes along. It's about having the vision to identify the technologies that have real staying power, the ones that will fundamentally change the way we live and work.
So it's not about being first. It's about being right.
Exactly. It's about making the right bets on the technologies that will ultimately matter. And that takes a certain amount of intuition, a deep understanding of how technology evolves.
And a willingness to take risks.
Absolutely. You have to be willing to bet on the future even when others are skeptical.
I think there's a lesson in there for all of us, regardless of our industry. The world is changing faster than ever before, And we all need to be willing to adapt and innovate.
I couldn't agree more. We can't afford to rest on our laurels. We need to embrace that never take your eye off the ball mentality that Bill Gates embodies.
It's easy to get complacent when you've achieved a certain level of success. But as Bill Gates' story shows, staying ahead of the game requires constant vigilance, a willingness to learn and to embrace the unknown.
I think that's a great takeaway from this deep dive into business the Bill Gates way. It's not just a book about technology or business strategy, it's a book about mindset. It's about cultivating that relentless drive, that insatiable curiosity, that willingness to push the boundaries of what's possible.
It's a fascinating story, even with all its complexities and contradictions. Bill Gates is a flawed figure, no doubt, but he's also a visionary who fundamentally changed the world.
And I think his story offers valuable lessons for anyone who aspires to make a dent in the universe.
Well said. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, but hopefully this has given our listeners a taste of what business the Bill Gates way is all about.
If you're interested in learning more about Bill Gates and his approach to business, I highly recommend picking up a copy of the book. It's packed with insights and anecdotes.
And who knows, maybe this deep dive will inspire the next Bill Gates in our audience. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Until next time, stay curious.